Hi, everybody. Welcome to Have You Ever Heard? If you had told me 35 years ago that when I was in my 40s, that I would be sitting here having a conversation with a songwriter whose work really, really shaped my life and gave me a lot of my theology, I would have said, I don't know how that's possible. But because of technology and COVID and God and all kinds of stuff, here we are. So
Here we
it's a
are.
it's a thrill to have Tori Taff, who many of you know as a songwriter, as an author, I still believe, co-author, um, personality, and just one of the greatest spirits I know. And I'm so
You
glad to have you here.
you are so dear. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and not screw up anything you just said. Let's just make them think that's all true.
Well, I was when I reached out to you about doing this, I thought I can't find anything online, any interviews about Tori talking about songwriting. And you're such a great writer. I mean, you've written songs that, have shaped not just me, but so many of us. And so I thought I want to know a little bit more. This is the record that I was referring to that was so shape shifting for me. And I know many other people, but I want to have kind of a broader conversation and just find out about your pen and where it comes from.
Oh,
So thank you.
thank you. I will answer anything, and most of it will be true.
Well, even the best stories need a little introduction.
There you go.
So, well, when did you start writing? How did you begin?
Um, Probably high school. I always wrote. My mom kept a bunch of things. When she died a few years ago, we were going through all the things that she had kept, and there was like a little booklet that I had made in the second grade that was about a horse. And at the end of it, the teacher had said something nice about it. Mom had kept it. And then years later, that same teacher wrote and said, I can't wait to see what you end up writing.
Wow.
I
Wow.
know, isn't that cool? And trust me, I read the horse story again. It wasn't that good, even by second grade standards. But I started writing probably in earnest, the sort of suicidal, angst ridden teenage poetry
Mhm.
of when you break up with the quarterback and you think your life is over. So there was a lot of that. But that's probably the first time I understood what it felt like to take your feelings and try to make them more concise and then try to put them in a form and then sit back afterwards and think, okay, that feels better. That's what I wanted to say. So that was probably the teenage years were
Wow.
when it started.
Did you, I mean, did you have a particular relationship with music at all or?
My entire family is musical. There are six children in my family, and my father played the oboe, and my mother played the piano.
Okay.
We did not have your family sing-alongs. It's just I think before they started having kids, they did that.
Okay.
Um, my oldest sister, we all had to take piano lessons. I sucked at it. Um,
It would be
I
both.
have my one of my brothers. I have a brother that plays the flute. I have another brother that plays guitar and keyboard. My my middle brother Joel became an oboe player. He graduated from LSU, where my dad's brother was the dean of music. He went to Yale
Wow.
and got his doctorate degree and played with the New York Philharmonic. And he was traveled all over. He's now in LA.
Okay.
He was retired professor from USC. So he was the music guy.
Wow.
And so when my parents would go through the line of all of us, they come to me and they go, and Tori married musical.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that how like you started shaping songs? Was that how or why when Russ was
Yes,
in the Imperials?
I was about 16 or 17 maybe when we met,
Okay.
and he was writing
Okay.
songs. And so he asked me to work on things with him. I think I'm a really hardcore co-writer collaborator at my deepest
Okay.
with anything. I always do better with someone to bounce an idea off of and to say, what do you think about that? And maybe that's not it. That's my comfort zone. There are a lot of lyrics that I started and would write a complete lyric, and then I'd still go to Russ or a co-writer and tweak it with them because it's just my comfort zone. And with Russ, I started kind of putting lyrics. In fact, the very first song we ever wrote was called Try Again, and it ended up on one of the Imperial albums.
Yes.
And that was one that we wrote when I was 17.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And your stories on those albums were so unique. Like I think about Be Still, My Soul. I think Whenever I Speak His Name, like the positioning, of the lead singer as the narrator in a sense of this story.
Right.
Your stories were so unique.
That's funny because we didn't have a formula.
Mm-hmm.
We were literally making it up as we go along. I'm very wordy.
Mm-hmm.
And when we would start writing, and Russ was very scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
So between my barrage of feelings, words, and him trying to cram in scripture, we kind of had to find our rhythm with, and it's a rare thing, I think. At the time it didn't appear to be, but now that I'm all these years later and I've co-written with so many other people,
Yes.
when you know it's right and it hits your ear right, and the other person is, you both at the same time go, that's it. That's not always as common as I thought it was when I first started writing with Russ. I think that we both have a very equal footing on, yeah, I think it's right now. And that helped a lot when we were writing. Also, I don't sing. Lordy, do I not sing? And but I have a pretty good sense of rhythm. I call it the dadas, and it's kind of the iambic pentameter when you're trying to get it to fit.
You have to know where the words are supposed to go.
Exactly. And so I would be able to come up with something without a melody in mind, but just like, I hear you have a soft spot for fools and little children. That if I could get that, and then when they would put it to music, it would make sense because I had already had the rhythm. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but that was our little system.
Writing 101. I mean, you've got to know the cadence, and how, whether the words are going to match,
Yes.
verse to verse. Of course, now songs only have a verse maybe, but
And I didn't, since I wasn't a singer, he had to instruct me as to what words would sing, because something that would be beautiful on the written page would not sound beautiful coming out of your mouth when you're trying to rhyme it and fit it in a. And so that was sort of a education on both of our sides. I think a really good example of wordy, one of our first songs was Eagle Song.
Love it. Yes.
I love that song as well, but that's a lot of words.
A lot of words.
And that's one that we kind of figured out how to make that one work, but that's my instinct. Left to myself, it would probably be a lot of that.
Well, that's another one of those unconventional, voices, in that you find in your writing in particular. And that was always one of my favorites of the Russ and Tori cuts, because I just think there's no other song like that. It stands so by itself.
And that was a real collaboration. Russ had the idea about an eagle flying. We literally were someplace in Arkansas. I think we were on the lake, and he saw an eagle fly, and sort of had that thought. And then my sister Liz had just had her first baby. And so the second verse says, tiny fingers curled round mine, perfectly formed, newborn, the image of two. I was a brand new aunt. Wow. And I had just seen him for the first time. So that was bubbling up in me. Wow. And so together it just started talking about those sort of eternal questions about what is freedom? Where does life come from? And so that was sort of the genesis of it.
Well, and when Russ went solo, left the Imperials, and you all started working on a record called Walls of Glass, his first solo project, the voice on that record emerges even because I feel like it's connected to Eagle Song in a sense, probably
Yeah,
because it's all from your pen. But that freedom story, I mean, I immediately think about I Want to Change
yeah,
on that record. And it's almost like therapy. There's something about that song that has a lot of self-analysis in it. Um, and I just went, you don't hear songs in Christian music that come from this place. And so that to me is the thread that connects your body of work together.
probably. That's very astute of you, because probably that song was born out of therapy.
Okay.
Because we wore out many a good therapist over the years. And if you the lyric of that song, it's funny. I don't revisit our stuff a lot. Russ never listens to himself at
Mhm.
home. Never listens to old music. Or the only time he ever really listens to himself is when he's working on a project and you listen to it over and over in the
Yep.
studio. Then he's done. When it's out, it's like he's
Yes.
done. And so I revisited that when uh, ASCAP, this was a huge thing to us. ASCAP awarded both of us their Golden Note Award, which was a tremendous thrill. And I'm not blasé about those things at all, but I'm especially not blasé about that one. And we had to revisit some of our songs because they were asking us what they wanted to, what we wanted to showcase. And when I went as far back as I Want to Change, it's funny in the sense of, if anybody has seen the documentary or read the book, that heart cry was so
Yes.
obvious then. And on the timeline, I think that was probably when, I don't know where it was, at least the seeds of addiction, of what ended up being a full-blown alcohol addiction, the seeds of that are in that song, because
Wow.
it's sort of that eternal, I'm not what I want to be, but like Paul said. And that struck me when I was reading it. I
Wow.
thought, well, there's, if you're gonna, that was a few breadcrumbs that we left along
Yes.
the way.
Yes. Well, and so I'm curious also about in being in the world that you were in at that time,
Mhm.
and those not being dominant conversations that people were having, especially in 1983, outside of therapy. What were you reading? Like, what were your inspirations other than your lives? Or was that everything? Was that the bulk of it? Was your
That was
experience what you were pulling from?
that was probably the bulk of it. There's always people we were listening to, and writers that we liked. We were always been. I love. Sorry, I know it's dated, but I can't help it. I'm of that generation. James Taylor's lyrics,
Timeless.
absolutely timeless. Mill worker. You could write. You could teach a seminar on songwriting on that one lyric.
Yes.
So there were those influences floating around, but Russ's voice really led a lot of our of our songwriting, which is weird because he can kind of sing anything, but um, fitting something to his voice was, it would sort of take us someplace. If it was a ballad, there's places he would want to stretch out on it. There's places that he would want to be quiet on it. But so that would be kind of musically, and then all the influences would be sort of always floating in there, but the actual content usually came from something that we were experiencing.
Okay. Well, in that record, we should say won a Grammy, uh, Walls of Glass, amazing record. And so I also want to set a little bit of context for time period here because this was a unique time um, in the world, but particularly in Christian music. I mean, I would say when I talk to younger people today about that music, there's not a lot of context for them because nothing that's happened in the last 25 years really compares to
I agree.
the synergy that was happening around Christian music in the larger world. It wasn't just contained to the church. So as you all were coming off of winning the Grammy for Walls of Glass, thinking about the second record, what was from your experience, what was happening within Christian music that might influence how you were preparing to make a record?
Gosh, there was so much going on. I really agree. I mean, everyone probably has a tendency to pick whatever the golden age is of whatever you do. You
Yes.
sort of you think it's whatever when you were doing it. That's
Right.
the golden age. But there was so much going on across the board. Um, Metals was the beginning of, or the timing of Metals was sort of the beginning of when Christian music, CCM music, was being seen as a commodity by the bigger labels. And so when Amy broke through and Michael W. was coming in there, and there was all of a sudden, a lot of record executives in LA and New York were sniffing around because there was money to be made.
Yes.
And so Amy led the way with
Mm-hmm.
that. In fact, I think when we toured Metals, I think he opened for Amy for a whole
Yes.
leg of
Unguarded. Yes.
yeah, of that tour. But there was also the Steve Taylors and the Charlie Peacocks coming up. And then there was a lot of pop music sound
Yes.
coming up. A lot of female artists, pop sounding female artists, as well as male, but it seems like more female then. So there was a lot. It sort of felt like we were without boundaries, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
When you start writing and when you start recording in the Christian world, we're sort of a subculture of a subculture
Right.
of a redheaded stepchild of a subculture.
Yes.
So the music is being pulled up into a little bit more of the mainstream, um, the main thing Russ was really interested in and thinking about when we were moving on to that record from Walls is he was very keyed into certain sounds that were coming out of LA. There's a masterful, amazing engineer when Bill Schnee was the producer for Walls of Glass, and his head engineer was a man named Jack Joseph Puig, who's gone on to Google him. He's gone
Yeah.
on to great and wonderful things. But when it came time for the second solo record, Russ wanted Jack Joseph to produce, and he sort of co-produced with him. Jack Joseph is a collaborator as well, but he also has a very clear vision, and he was tuned into the absolute newest sounds and sonic revelations coming out of pop music. And
Yes.
so he was getting sounds that we hadn't heard before in Christian music.
Mm-hmm.
And we were using the people who played on that record. We had guys from Toto, Abraham
Yes.
Laboriel, my two favorite singers, background singers from James Taylor, the Arnold McCuller and
Yes.
David Lasley, who I
Yes.
adored. They
Love.
sang back up on it. So it was Jack brought all that in. And so it was, and Robbie Buchanan, that
Yes.
keyboard sound that you ended
Yes.
up hearing for the entire rest of the 80s.
Yes.
90%. Now you hear the keyboard and it's like, oh God, it's the 80s. But 90% of that was probably Robbie Buchanan. He
Wow.
played on everything. So um, it was a freeing experience for Russ and myself as writers, because Schnee, we were intimidated. It was his first solo album. And so by the time we were going into the second one, it felt more like we got a handle on a little more sure of ourselves, a
Yes.
little a little more sure-footed. And so that's kind of how we headed into it.
Well, and message wise, I mean, the one thing that in reading some of the old interviews, Russ talked about, and it's interesting because people really talk about that era And I think retrospectively, there's a lot of rewriting that's gone on. And so people see it as like the big compromise period, and people were selling out and not wanting to say Jesus. And, you know,
God or your girlfriend. Yeah.
and then you listen to this album today, and I go, it is one of the most evangelistic records you're ever going to hear. And so you all talked about the importance of messaging in these songs, that you didn't want to, you wanted to make music that felt good, but you also wanted to put forward a particular message about faith and, you know, compromise and militant, I think was the word that you used.
It's so funny to think of that now, but yes, I agree.
But I think that the universal, now we hear that and we're a little bit frightened by that
Exactly.
idea.
Has a different connotation.
But in the context of this record, really it is about self-determination more than anything else, which I think is another overarching theme in the Russ and Tori catalog. And so I want to talk a little bit about, as you were writing, because this process was a little different. You and Russ wrote the bulk of the material on the prior record kind of as an isolated unit. And on this record, it's so branched out and collaborative. And I love that. You had songs from that you co-wrote, I should say, not that came from, but Chris Eaton in particular, Michael Landau, that really blew my mind, Roby Duke. And so you've got such a wide range of writers that were bringing songs to the table. How were those coming in? And then when you heard these songs initially, you then joined a writing process with them. So can we talk a little bit about that?
In retrospect, I can't believe writers let us do this because frankly, I wouldn't. These were the songs that you're referring to and the writers you're referring to. Most of those, it was not the we're all in the same room working on a song thing. It was, these were existing songs that they were sending to our producer, and we would be going through, and there would be things that we loved, but because of where we had just talked about things were in the industry, we were trying to balance something that we used to call it God or your girlfriend songs. So you could be talking about God, you'd be talking about your girlfriend. So because there were a lot of people and music crossing over, we used to call it.
Yep.
We were getting a lot of songs that with an ear towards crossing over. And that was fine, except that some of the songs lyrically were excellent songs, but maybe not, they wouldn't really work because Russ never wanted to, he knew who he was singing to.
Yes.
So he didn't want it to become unrecognizable. And so these more than A-list writers graciously, and with the hubris of youth, we apparently asked if we could do this. They graciously allowed us to sort of tinker with them. And some of them, it was kind of a major rewrite. And a lot of them, it literally was tweaking. And when I look back on it too, if somebody was trying to do that with like something we wrote, I would think, oh, are you just like trying to tack your name on it so it'll look like you're one of the writers too? And I can honestly tell you that was not even in our brain. It was, I love this song. It just isn't going to work in the exactly as is. And so that's probably how the whole thing started, is that they called and said, what do you think? And we said, love it, would record it in a minute. But lyrically, there's just some things that I don't think is going to work with my audience. And so they said, like, what things? And we were able to, Chris Eaton allowed us to do some tinkering, Paul James, all the writers that you named. And like I said, we've never done that, I think, before or since.
Wow.
And I can't believe that they let us. But I don't know. It was sort of the time and the place and I guess there was a lot of trust they obviously would have the final okay. I can't remember any sort of going back and forth or disagreement or anything. I can't
Wow.
remember somebody saying, you just butchered our song, we're going to take it back. So that was an odd way. It was sort of writing and rewriting. And again, these amazing, obviously very secure in their talent writers allowed us to do that. And so, I haven't even thought of this until you brought this up, but I'm wondering if part of the not gonna bow and part of the flat out in your face, this is my belief, was sort of some kind of subconscious, if we have some that are sounding like Silent Love,
The
then
offset.
maybe we're going to have, there's not going to be any doubt about this one. I think the God or Your Girlfriend stuff was starting to kind of get on our nerves. And so
Mhm.
we were like, okay, let's just be real clear here. I cannot remotely say that we did not want to have success in a larger arena. That was, but the idea of becoming something else, which by the way, I don't remotely believe that Amy or Michael W. did,
That's
but
right.
that's what we wanted to make sure it's still, but again, the fact that we were hanging on to our integrity and we're changing the integrity of people's lyrics and they allowed us to do that is just remarkable to me.
Well, and this is the interesting thing. I wanted to note a few things about you and Russ as here's a solo artist. Russ is a solo artist, but you were always, he always made you visible. You're he's the only artist I can think of whose wife is prominently positioned on almost every album. You're a co-writer.
Yeah.
And you're doing interviews with him. I mean,
It is odd, isn't it?
I find
Because
it interesting.
I was most certainly not the artist. That was never in question. It was never like, oh, let me take a verse on this one.
Right.
I never wanted to be the artist. You know what it was? We met when I was in high school, and Russ is 3 years older than I am.
Okay.
And we married when I was 20.
Wow.
I know, jailbait. And we came into our relationship with each other very much as equals. And he brought things to the table that I didn't, and vice versa. And so it was a good match. And so when we moved to Nashville, started learning the business, the music business. I was right there because that's what we did everything. I mean, it would have been weird for me just to disappear because that isn't how we ran our lives. We didn't think anything of it. I remember very distinctly figuring out that was a little not the norm. I remember being in a meeting. It was when Russ was getting romanced hard and fast for the solo career. A lot of record companies were taking us out to really good dinners. And I remember being in a boardroom of a record company I won't mention, and everyone was nice, but it was sort of like, that isn't it cute that you brought your wife? And I remember asking questions, and they would nod and listen, and then answer Russ.
Wow.
So it was like oh, I didn't even see her lips move. And I didn't take huge affront at it. I just thought it was weird because my mind works in different ways than Russ's sometimes. And so I would maybe think of an aspect of it that he wouldn't have thought of to ask, and vice versa. And it was so strange to me that it would be, I'd ask the question and they'd nod like, good question, and then turn to Russ to answer. And but I was so young and stupid. I thought it was funny.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know to be offended and to get my,
Yes.
my liberated woman panties in a wad. We thought it was funny. And I think because of the dynamics of our relationship, I always felt like I had something to bring to the party, but I never felt like I had to push my way in, or I was trying to be the manager god or
right. No.
anything like that. So because we were real clear on those roles, it didn't really shake us when other people weren't. And after a while, they just got used to me, I guess.
Well, and you know, I don't want to get too hooey gooey, but it does, in my mind, explain why, in many senses, we hear music that is quite militant, and it's kind of terrifying. Um, but when I heard metals, and now I'm really putting together, probably I'm a little slow. It took me 35 years, but that it is the masculine feminine balance of the lyricism that I think makes it so relatable to everyone. Because
I haven't thought of that.
I hadn't either until just now. And I just went, that's why, because a lot of it is the balance of your two energies and the fact that you were presented in many senses as co-creators. It
is weird. It's weird to think that I don't even know. I don't think we even used titles or words with each other like that. And also, you got to remember, I was touring. I was with the band on the bus all the time. So it would have been very strange to then completely be divorced from anything that had to do with and again, it wasn't because I was the lyric queen or a marketing genius or the business whiz at all. It was just, we were both learning this as we went.
Yeah.
And we had a wonderful manager, Zach Glickman, for 35 years, the only Jew in Christian music. And he was wonderful. He was such an advocate for us. We lost him in 2015 to cancer, and I miss him and talk about him frequently. He was an amazing advocate and friend. And he handled the sort of, all the negotiation part and the contracts and all that. So I wasn't trying to be anything. It just was the nature of our relationship. And there was the masculine and feminine lines blurred.
Yes.
For example, if I ask a business question and Russ would be talking about a feelings question, and it kind of ebbed and flowed in our relationship. So it didn't seem weird in the commercial sense, but upon retrospect, it probably kind of was.
Well, and I want to ask one more question about the songs too, because there's one song on here that sounds, and I had to remind myself that Pam Mark Hall wrote the lyric, but it's so connected to like, I Want to Change. It's that kind of song. And so then when I reread the CCM interview, which we should show this because it's such a great cover. Isn't that great?
Snap those fingers, Russ.
You said that you all had an idea for the song and couldn't finish it, didn't have time to finish it, and you called Pam Mark Hall in a pinch and she churned this out. And it sounds like a Russ and Tori song in so many ways. And I don't mean that because Pam also has that through line in her work. So it was the perfect person to call. And so I want to talk about that too, because I feel like this album really showcases you all, not just as songwriters, song editors, song rewriters, but also as it's very almost savantish. Like, we can't finish this, we'll call Pam. You knew who to call to get the song you needed. And
I'm not even sure how that connection happened. And I'll tell you the God's truth. I ran across that song not real long ago, and I had to say, did we write that? Because it sounded like us to me.
Yes.
And it's not until I looked it up and saw her name and went, oh yeah, that was Pam. Pam wrote that. And it's not until you just brought it up that I'm remembering vaguely the circumstances of it. And it is true. There was a huge time crunch going on, and we were really trying to, and we don't write quickly. We're not like churn them out. I mean, there have been those struck by lightning moments where you come out with kind of most of the whole thing. Reba does that all the time. It makes me so mad. Reba will just be like minding her own business, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a song. That doesn't usually happen with us. It's more like oh,
Yeah.
but um, I remember feeling like the gist of it was there, and the music, and and she came through, and like I said, it was to the point that when I read it, I wasn't sure if we wrote it or not.
Well, and we should say also like the results, 4 top 10 hits from this record, um, 2 years of touring.
Yes.
Um, and so I would like to also then, because the other part of songwriting is not just hearing it on the record, getting them on the record, it is also then seeing them live out in
Yeah.
the world. And I did get to see the Metals tour as a little 10-year-old. I was so
Oh,
excited. I had my little medal, was so excited. But I remember being at that concert and hearing those songs being sung out loud by thousands of people. And it was so, I mean, as just a fan, it was something. It was really something. So as a writer, what was your experience with these songs once they went out into the world?
I mean, it's a songwriter's cliche is to talk about the first time you hear it on the radio or the first time they sing it back to you. The reason that's a cliche with songwriters is because it is so magnificent when it happens. I mean, the radio thing was cool, but Christian radio then and now is sort of, again, a subculture of a stepchild of a subculture. So it was always cool to hear it, but nothing approaches the live feel. And those the crowd's response, especially when it was new. I remember when Metals, that whole tour was starting. They brought in a Joan Tankersley, who the two of this is so weird. The two of us flew down to a Dallas, and there was a Army Navy huge outlet store that she knew about, and we were shopping for clothes for the tour and kind of trying to go with the theme. And so there's all this preparation, getting ready for the tour because we knew this was going to be bigger than the other album had been. And so when you're finally out there and the band has their little outfits on, which I think some of have still not forgiven me for, um, but there's so much prep that goes into it. And then when it's here and they start singing something and the audience is singing it back and it's only barely been out, not very long, that's when it's amazing because you know something resonated and you know that people are latching on to it in the same way that you latched onto it when you were birthing it. And so that will never get old. We have sung, and by this time I do mean we, because as an audience member, a professional audience member, we have sung We Will Stand a quadrillion times, and it still has that moment where the music drops out and you hear those voices, and it's sort of like kumbaya, touchy feely, but it also is just this sort of feeling of something that it's like having a kid, something that you've done is sort of immortal. Not in a grandiose way, but in a way that there's songs in my life that I quote lyrics from still. Bill and Gloria Gaither, two of my favorite people in the world and writers, and to this day they will be sitting at lunch with you somewhere and talk about, oh, that song, not one of theirs usually, but that song of that so and so, and they'll start quoting lyrics and Bill will tear up.
Yeah.
They move him to this day, and I have songs that do that. So to feel like you did something that means that to somebody else is just like, how do you not love that? And how are you not humbled and just, it's miraculous to me.
Well, and I know that there was a European leg of this tour. I feel like I have to mention because you did that with Andre Crouch, if I'm not mistaken. There was a
Yes, we toured Europe with Andre twice.
wow.
That was great. Tata Vega was Bill Maxwell. Tata was on that tour. I remember one of they love a good choir over in those Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
I also will mention that a whole lot of of Andre's band members came back with Swedish wives.
Wow.
Yeah, but there was a I remember doing a huge thing, arena, and it had a huge choir behind it because they love a good choir. And every time an artist comes, if they have something that lends itself towards choir, honey, they got it ready. And it was it was actually, they put flooring over an ice rink. It was like a giant hockey arena or something.
Wow.
So I remember like the drummer losing the feeling in his legs about midway through the concert. But they talk about being on stage with someone who people know their music.
Yeah.
Russ and I, our very first date was to an Andre Crouch concert.
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah. So that was kind of a full circle moment.
Wow. My first concert was Andre.
Was it really?
Ever. I was almost 4, but yes,
Yeah.
that was my first concert.
Yeah, so was I. Okay, maybe not. But
yes, you were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was remarkable. We went to, I'm trying to think where else. We may have gone to Australia.
Wow.
During that time, we did a lot of Scandinavia. And gosh, that just sort of, that tour went on and on and on, and it was so much fun.
Well, I think it's important to also note, like, 2 of my favorite writers also emerged in a sense through you. They had a life with Found Free, Bash in the Code, and then I think towards the end of this tour, Greg and Rebecca Sparks joined you, if I've got the timing right, and also incredible songwriters that
my goodness. And such good friends, such amazing lifelong friends. One of the things I remember when Greg and Becca first came on, they had invited us to go on some of those Found Free cruises, those
Yes.
80s cruises. There were like Leslie Phillips at the time, now Sam Phillips. There was always just this gaggle of Randy Stonehill and Phil Kagi and so many. It was like these gang concerts, and of course Found Free with the hair and the air. It was so much fun. And so I think Russ sang with them on one of those tours, or they came in to sing backup or whatever. But it was sort of everybody jumps on stage.
Yes.
And when they came with us, that changed the nature of everything. It changed the dynamic on the bus. They're strong worship oriented people, not in the praise and worship as we now call it, but just in the sense of wanting to get their music to take you to a place that's where you're connected to something bigger than you. And that was where they wanted to take you. And so whether they were being featured or whether they were sitting on a monitor and singing Steal Away a cappella with Russ, and then James coming in on that slide, or I remember the first time I heard them, they had a song. It was from a Martin Luther King quote, something about a tunnel of hope through this mountain of despair.
Yes,
I'll carve a tunnel of hope through this mountain of despair. I was pressuring Russ so hard. I wanted him to cut that song so badly. And then finally he said, Tori, I think the reason you love that song is because of the way Greg and Rebecca do that song. And I said, you know what? I think you're right. But they brought so much to the party, and they have been amazing people in our lives to this day. Russ was with them not very long. I think they had him come and do, what's the big festival, Creation Festival?
Creation, yep.
That they still kind of are doing.
Yes.
They wanted Russ to come because he's a classic artist now. And Greg and Rebecca met him there, and the 3 of them did the performance together. But yeah.
Wow. Well, there's and more collaborators. Oh, go ahead.
And Becca's voice on that low moan on the intro into Charlie Peacock's Down in the Lowlands, nobody will ever do it better.
Well, and they wrote one of those songs. I had to go, did Russ and Tori wrote that, right? Things Will Be Different From Now On, which is another.
That is a James Holohan song.
Okay, so that's
James wrote that, and that was a James Holohan song from beginning to end.
Was it?
It was. And James is an amazing writer. I mean, he's such a cool player that you sort of think of him as the guitar god. But we called him Dr. J. James, he was a real strong presence on I Cry as well. That was the 3 of us together. But he had that was his vision to start with. But James had an alcoholic parent.
Okay.
and Russ had an alcoholic parent. And that song is that hopeful child saying,
Yes.
this time it's going to be different. And it's written from the perspective of the wife and the child, and it's heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking.
And Russ at that point was just starting to get in touch with the degree of trauma that he had experienced growing up. He just sort of, was trying to flush that out of his life, or drink that out of his life. And that song broke me the first time I heard it. And when I look back now, it's probably very brave of Russ to put it on a record. Yes. Because it was very naked, even though he didn't write it. It was he and James have known each other since high school. Yes. So it was very much the same experience, and it's kind of universal. That's an incredible song, I think.
Well, there's one more collaborator. I know you worked with him on the first 2 records. I feel like it's important to raise him. I believe he's transitioned. Raymond Brown.
Yeah.
And so I want to remember him.
Raymond was one of my favorite people. He had a wicked sense of humor. And Raymond approached he loved God with everything in him. And he was a perpetual outsider. Okay. In the industry. And we met him through Cynthia Clausen and Reagan Courtney. We ended up buying their house, which was about 4 blocks over from Raymond. But when they lived in our house, they had a woman who was their nanny, and her name was Bonzetta. And Bonzetta was a member of a 4-women voice from their Black church group that sang at their church. And Bonzetta would bring the women over, and they would rehearse at Cynthia and Reagan's. And we'd lift the windows up, open the windows, and those voices around the piano would be going out into the neighborhood. And so we would get a phone call. Raymond would call us, or Cynthia would call us and say, Bonzetta's they're rehearsing tonight. So we'd show up, we just kind of wander in and sit down. And before the evening was over, they'd all be around the piano. So my first introduction to Raymond was watching him sit at the piano and banging out those songs, and those women just wailing.
Wow.
And he toured with us for a while. He sang backup off and on. Yeah, sort of a fill-in guy, but he was a pleasure. And it was a sad death, and he's someone I think of often. He was an amazing writer and human being.
Wow. Well, I'm interviewing this season also Bob Bailey.
Yeah.
In his I'm Walking record, and Bob and Raymond collaborated quite a bit through the years as well. So thank you for that. Well, and we've given everybody a lot of seedlings. And so I want to point people to Russ and Tori's book. I still believe it's an incredible story of recovery, self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-possession, ultimately. And if you're struggling with anything, there's some great knowledge in this book that I know will help you. So I hope you'll pick it up. There's also an accompanying documentary, and it's on Amazon Prime. It's everywhere you stream video. So you should watch their story. And we've talked about some of the songs you'll hear in the documentary. Well, I thank you, Tori, for sharing this hour with me. I'm so grateful. I hope it was as good for you as it was for me.
Oh, Russ and I are just crazy about you.
Oh, I love you.
I mean, granted, it came from Reba. If Reba loves you, we kind of have to. But that was before I got to know you at all. And I respect you and appreciate who you are so much. And thank you for doing this.
Well, we just want to keep the music alive. And if you haven't heard any of these wonderful songs, just go to Spotify. You can look up Russ Taff. You can look up First Call, and you'll hear a Tori Taff song. You can go to Gaither Vocal Band. You're going to hear a Tori Taff song. just go to Discogs and look around. What has she written on? Because your pen has, again, just touched so many of our lives. And so we're thankful.
Thank you, Tim.